Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Springer. I'm a graduate learning specialist at National University, and thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to have Dr. Brianna Nicholson here today presenting. She is coming back to us as an associate director in the Academic Success Center to discuss data mining in Nvivo. And just some very brief housekeeping items. We are recording today's session. We encourage you to utilize the chat. Please ask questions in the Q&A, and we're going to get to questions as time permits. You do have options for scrolling subtitles should you want to utilize them throughout today's session. And if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to try to find me in the chat. I look forward to assisting you if you have any additional questions. Dr. Nicholson, I think that about covers my brief housekeeping items for today's Skill Up, and I will be turning this right on over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. I have to take full responsibility for the technical difficulties. Something is going on in my computer that won't allow me to share. So I thank our gracious hostess for her sharing her screen and being able to share the PowerPoint with you all. My name is, again, Dr. Brianna Nicholson, and I am one of the coaches in the Academic Success Center that has some familiarity with Nvivo. We'll talk a little bit about how you can connect with the Academic Success Center a little closer to the end. But I just want to let you know that Nvivo is not as scary as it may seem, and it really is a tool to assist and support in your analysis. I really want you to have confidence in yourself as researchers. Nvivo cannot do anything that you don't tell it to do. So I want you to really lean into yourself as a researcher and understand that it is a helpful tool, but it is not a replacement of you. And so you are still the primary data tool. You still have your analytical expertise that you use to interpret and present your results and findings. So I just wanted to lead with that. Next slide, please. Just wanted to go over some brief session objectives. We're going to talk briefly about appropriate use just to kind of level set. I want to make sure that we're at the same place as we build this discussion. We're going to talk about starting strong very briefly, what to do now that you're done coding, why that deeper dive may be helpful, and how these tools are helpful in understanding and exploring your data. Next slide, please. As we think about appropriate uses for Nvivo, we know that Nvivo is used for coding data, gathering your data, exploring your data, managing your data, organizing your data. You can add additional details and descriptions to your data. And really, its primary function and the function I tout and highlight is that it is able to help you be more agile in your analysis. I hand coded my first round of data, and when I tell you that hand coding paper and pens and highlighters and sticky notes can get quite cumbersome, Nvivo is really a tool to help in that organizational process. And so Nvivo can really assist in the naming, the renaming, the refining and movement of your codes and descriptions. Next slide, please. So we want to start strong as it relates to data mining Nvivo. We want to begin with the end in mind. We want to establish a plan. So beginning with the end in mind really means, what is the goal of your data? I know I encourage learners to tack up your research questions, tack them up somewhere, paste them, put them on a sheet of paper, paste them on the wall, stick them onto your keyboard wrist rest, whatever that may be, but begin with that end in mind. And the end for our analysis is to answer or address our research questions. And so we want to keep that in mind as we're approaching the data. We want to establish a plan. You want to import your data. Import is important. Obviously, we can't analyze an in vivo if the data is not in vivo. We want to explore and familiarize ourselves with the data. We can do that in or outside of in vivo. We're going to talk a little bit about queries. Queries are a helpful way to find initial insights that we may want to explore further. We're going to talk a little bit more about memos and how memos can be helpful. We want to definitely code our data and code it accurately, and then spend time in reflection. I think one of the things that myself included, we as researchers do not do a great deal of is reflect. Reflect on what we've coded, how we've coded, and that process. And reflection is key in qualitative inquiry. Context is key in qualitative inquiry. And then you want to practice the basics. Nvivo has some great sample tutorials that you don't have to be scared of. You can delete and move and click around without fear of accidentally deleting or removing your own data. So I encourage you, some of the things we're going to talk about today, don't try it first in your own data where you may be nervous to click that button for fear of what it might do. Try it in the sample projects. Import, organize, code, move things around, take things out, really play in the sample project. And I think that will help increase your confidence as a researcher and increase your comfort level with in vivo, because that's really 60% of the battle is comfort with the tool itself. Next slide, please. So we may be thinking, now what? I want to set some ground rules here. I'm going to use the word code as both a noun and a verb in this presentation. Sometimes that causes some confusion. We code, we do the action of coding, and we also find codes. So we also find the nouns of code. So that will be used throughout this presentation. The word theme may also be used in this presentation, but it's not meaning the theme that comes at the end of all of this analysis process. Typically, when I'm using the word theme, it's meaning an idea of repetition or patterns, and it's not necessarily that eye on the prize that we're looking for as it relates to answering or addressing our research questions. So kind of keep that in mind. But now that we have our data coded, we are very entrenched in our data, very immersed in our data. Now what? We want to make sure that we enhance any insights that we can from our data. What can we do to better understand or better dive into our data? We also can use these tools to efficiently search and sort our data. When we do this deeper dive that we'll discuss in a moment, it also aids in the interpretation of complex qualitative data. Sometimes we forget that words carry meaning. Words carry meaning, but they are not separate from the person who spoke those words or who wrote those words down. We are complex creatures, and as a result, sometimes our answers and responses are just as complex. And so using some of these tools can assist in that deeper understanding and interpretation of the data. Also, we have learners who review and best learn information in many different ways. What I may be able to glean from just the narrative, someone else may need a chart or need a graph or a table. And so we'll talk about some of those options as well. And, as a final step, these measures also help us establish some measure or means of trustworthiness. We often in the Academic Success Center get questions about, well, how do I write up this trustworthiness piece? Using some of these additional queries and functions in Nvivo support two aspects of trustworthiness in particular: credibility. Credibility deals with how do we know our findings are true? We know our findings are true when we can establish and demonstrate the patterns that are present in our data. The second means of trustworthiness that is positively impacted is confirmability. Confirmability is evidence of your audit trail. How did you navigate through this process of analysis? And so these are tangible steps that you can take within Nvivo to support aspects of trustworthiness for your study. So these are the now what these items can help us do in terms of exploration, interpreting our data, and these are key things to keep in mind, that it does help enhance your understanding of your data. But I, again, want to make sure that you know how important you are in that process, that there's nothing Nvivo can do that will surpass your meaningful conclusions and your own interpretation and analysis. This is merely a tool to help you better understand or organize that data. Next slide, please. So why a deeper dive? Why do we need to have this deeper dive in information? And I will speak for myself. Having a tool such as Nvivo to help with the organization and compilation of the data is very important. I cannot, I am human. As I read through things, I may miss things. One of the great features of Nvivo, the frequency, the word frequency, we'll talk about in a moment, the query features that we'll talk about in a moment, some of the visuals that we can create in Nvivo are helpful with my human eyes that may glance over or not see things clearly, helps me to stay on track and say, oops, I forgot a whole section there. I need to go back and look at that. Or, you know what, that is a word or something from my participants that I missed in my first glance or my first perusal of the data. So these items really help us better understand our own data. It helps us not miss a beat. So let's talk about some of these deeper dives. First, let's talk about some low stakes dives. Sometimes we're so nervous about Nvivo that we're like, well, where can I do the least damage? And this is actually where I started in Nvivo. It's like, where can I do the least damage? Where can I have the least impact on my data? And there's two areas that that would qualify for. First is word frequency. The word frequency query, and we'll go into Nvivo here momentarily to show you where many of these queries are. The word frequency query is meant to identify the frequency of specific words in our data. So it will generate, Nvivo will generate a list of the most frequently occurring words. Do not mistake this for coding. We know that sometimes participants use a word quite frequently, but they actually mean something else. I may consistently say frustration, 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 but what I really mean is hurt, hurt, hurt when I look at the context around it. So this helps us, though, maybe identify words that we may have glossed over, or words that we may not have, kind of pulled out in context before. So word frequency helps us by basically counting the number of times each word appears in your data. And it can help you in understanding words that your participants use quite frequently. And that can help you in your deepening of your analysis. What do my participants actually mean when they say frustration? They use frustration continually, but when I'm looking at the data, they really mean something else. So that tells you something about your participants. Autocode. Autocode, again, is not to be mistaken for actual coding of the data. I wish Nvivo would name that something differently, but it is what it is for now. Autocode is a feature that allows us to group information. We can group items by structure. For example, many of you may be using social media for a data source, so maybe a blog, or what is it called now? I don't know if it's called Twitter or tweets. I don't know what anything is called now. I'm so out of the loop. But some of you may be using social media. If we want to group information by maybe a particular hashtag that's being used, or if we want to group information that came from a particular platform or from a particular location within that platform, neat teachers or whatever the group is called. We can do that with AutoCode. Another great feature about AutoCode, especially for those of you that are considering conducting focus groups. Focus groups allows us to group information by speaker. AutoCode is helpful because I don't have to, once your information is transcribed, I don't have to then copy and paste and put all of my speaker information together. As we know in qualitative inquiry, yes, the whole transcript is important, but each of your participants is also a data source within that focus group. So it's important to understand not just the whole, but also the sum of the parts. So it's helpful to use the AutoCode feature to pull speaker comments together, speaker one, speaker two, however you're naming those individuals in that focus group. And so that information will be pulled together easily. And so you're then able to do a deeper dive into what were the sentiments of participant one, what were the sentiments of participant two, as you are looking at that focus group transcript as a whole. So these quote unquote low stakes dives actually give us some great information that serve as starting points for our analysis. I'm going to talk about these other two areas, and then I'm going to move actually into Nvivo Live. So I know some of you may have questions, but I would like to get us into Nvivo so that we can talk about some of these things a little bit in more depth. So we also have querying features. Queries allow us to search for data expeditiously. We can search for specific words, we can search for phrases, we can search for people. We can search for, once we've coded our data, we can query our codes. We can also query patterns between our codes, and we'll talk about those different features in a moment. Another feature that is very helpful that I want you as researchers to start thinking about early on in your analysis process are memos. Memorandums are these little, I call them virtual Post-it notes. They allow us to really place ourselves separate from the data. They allow us to jot down notes or our ideas or even bracket our own thoughts. So another means of trustworthiness, that credibility, that dependability, that certainty that the findings are a result of our participants' responses and not our own. This is very helpful with that bracketing. Some literature may call it epoche, where we are making sure that when something pops into our mind, maybe a judgment, maybe some information that is not congruent with what the participant is sharing, that we jot it down so that we can deal with it and make sure that it's not painting a picture over what the participant is actually saying. So memos are actually very helpful, and we'll talk about those in a moment. And then visuals. There are charts and diagrams and reports. Now, I always preface that the charts and diagrams produced in Nvivo, unfortunately, are not APA compliant. You can do a screenshot, I guess, and make them a figure. But to actually copy and paste many of the charts and diagrams, they're really not APA compliant. Also, some of the charts and diagrams are not really conducive to what you're trying to share with your data. As we know, charts and diagrams are probably going to do a lot of counting. What we want to think of as helpful means for charts and graphs are ways that we can visually see a representation for those of us that may be more visual learners. Maybe we need to see the code in a graph format or in a pie chart format that's helpful. And then reports. No, these aren't going to, give you your chapter 4 on a platter, unfortunately. But the reports that we can export from Nvivo include our code list. Again, the export is not going to be APA compliant, but at least gives us a start to creating that code book that is often an appendix in our work. And it also gives us some different ways that we can review how we've grouped those items together. So for example, if we have created categories, or if we've identified how those categories bundle together. So reports are very helpful. All right, Emily, you can stop sharing. Thank you for that. I'm going to share my screen so that we can see Nvivo in action. So hopefully my Nvivo screen is showing. I wouldn't leave it to my computer to do something weird with me now, but you
It's
should be.
looking good.
It's looking good. All right, that's great. So this is Nvivo as it looks. Now I have a sample project in here. Again, I encourage you to click around the sample projects if you have not already. This is going to be helpful in terms of just a very entry-level point so that you're not working with your own live data, so that you're not afraid about clicking around. But let's go back and talk about some of these query functions. I'm going to move a couple of bars out of the way. All right, so let's make sure that we have an understanding of some of these query functions. We're going to start with the queries. We'll move into talking about some of the memos and then charts. And I'm trying to keep an eye on time. Any one of these discussions could be the whole 45 minutes. So we'll also wrap up with talking about how you can engage with the Academic Success Center for your data, because everyone's data is different. So we want to make sure that you have that opportunity as well. So when you're in Nvivo, there's going to be two places that are going to be extremely helpful for you as you do this deeper mining of the data. The first tab that I want to encourage you is to peruse is the Explore tab. The Explore tab is where the queries fit and where our chart and diagram functions sit as well. When you are in the Explore tab, you'll see that there is an advanced find feature. Now I'm going to, I've done some of these in advance. So just because Nvivo, while it's very helpful, it runs very slowly. So I didn't want it to stop the computer and stop the process or the flow, but these will be helpful for you as you do click around. So I encourage you, once this presentation is over, click around and get familiar with some of these areas. Of course, we have our basic find feature, but I want to draw your attention to the query wizard. The query wizard, for those of you that get nervous about, and myself included, I use the query wizard. I do not feel comfortable just kind of developing some of these queries myself. I need to use the query wizard. The query wizard helps us create some of the queries that are already present here in the bar. So the query wizard will allow us to basically walks us through questions that we may want to ask. Do we want to see where particular terms occur in content in the data that you've collected? Do we want to identify frequently occurring terms in the content? Do we want to search for content based on how it's coded? Or do we want to find coding intersections? So let's talk about some of those items in a little bit more specificity. First, the text search. The query wizard allows us to find occurrences of a word or phrase. That is essentially a text search. So when you want to know if a particular word appears, you can search for different items. For example, if I know I'm looking for professional development, I'm going to maybe type in professional development and do an exact match. If I know that I'm looking for a term that folks may use different versions of, for example, learning. Someone may say learn, learns, but I know ultimately I want to see what text encompasses learning. I can use the stemmed word options. Nvivo is just getting smart enough that it can also look up synonyms. If I want to look up talk, it's going to look up speak. It's going to look up converse. What are the different ways that your participants are talking about the way they speak with others? And so you want to be to think about how you want to mine the data. Again, I encourage you, if you are looking for certain text within the data, keep in mind that this is going to pull information that is fairly accurate. So for example, if there are a lot of misspellings in the transcript, some of those items may get passed over. So keep that in mind as well. You'll want to make sure that all of your data are imported into Nvivo when running things, running queries and such, because you want it to be a robust look at all of your data. When you think about the text search, you can also think about, okay, what is it that I really want to know about my data? Maybe it's not the finding the word itself. Maybe I want to know about how many times that word appears. That is a word frequency, sometimes also called a word cloud. The word frequency pattern of data often, lends itself to thinking, maybe those are codes. I want to encourage you to fight against that urge if at all possible. This will give you the number of times a word appears. But keep in mind, we as humans, some of the natural things we do in conversation is we will often repeat words that are said to us in a question. And so if you have a word that comes to the top quite frequently, you may need to check your data, check your questions, and see if that's something that you actually said to the participant, because that may be why that word is frequently indicated. So keep in mind, this will really be used more for an opportunity to highlight words that you may have glossed over or missed. This should not be a replacement for actual coding of the data. I'm not going to run this query. I know from experience that the word frequency query will clog up the system. It's not anything that wouldn't take 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, but I just want to be mindful of that time. The other piece that is very helpful in Vivo are running different types of queries. We have a coding query. There's a cross tab, which we don't use quite often, but we will talk about the coding tab, the coding query, and we'll talk a little bit about the matrix coding query. Those are the kind of two that we see used most often or most frequently. If you have questions about these other options, we can definitely kind of talk through those or discuss those, or those may be something very specific to your data that we can maybe schedule an individual session for. Queries using the coding query. Coding queries allow us, once you've coded your data, see the other functions help you to kind of get into the data and understand maybe where something may have been missed. Now we know that we've coded all of our data, we're confident in our codes, and now we want to have a deeper understanding so that we can start to interpret our data. The coding query actually allows us to pull information that is associated with specific codes. So we can now look at particular aspects of our data. When we run the coding query, one of the key things that's important to know is I can see what content has been coded and then see something else. So for example, if I have professional development as a code, I can then see, did that code appear in some of my attributes? For example, if I've interviewed 15 teachers and I've applied attributes to them, maybe some of them are novice, maybe some of them are experienced, maybe some of them are male, maybe some of them are female, maybe some of them have been teaching, maybe some of them are under 30 and some of them are over 40, whatever the case may be. Those are attributes. Anything that you have used to kind of categorize and describe your participants are attributes. I can now see, did all of my participants indicate professional development? Oh, you know what? It was only the novice participants, the novice teachers that indicated professional development as a code. And so that can help me have a deeper understanding of not just what my data says, but also begin to be able to describe and explain that data, that professional development seems to be something that rises to the top for the novice teachers in this sample and not so much the experienced teachers in this sample, as an example. For the matrix coding query, when we come back to the Explore tab, matrix coding. Matrix coding allows us to do something very similar, but now I'm going to look at two coding criteria. So instead of the one, instead of just saying, hey, how did my novice teachers, did any of my novice teachers say professional development? Now I may want to see, you know what, when my participants coded something as, or when my data was coded as professional development, I wonder if where I coded things professional development, I also had something that talked about tenure or advancement. Maybe those folks are tying professional development to their movement through the tenure and rank system. So now I can tell my system, I can tell Nvivo, anytime I have something coded as professional development, is it also near something that's related to tenure? And that will pull up for me. And so that query helps us understand deeper information into our data. If I just coded the data, and this is something that is very powerful in Nvivo because it's something that's hard to do by hand. Because when I code by hand, I get a list of my codes. I understand how many times that code appears. I know where it came from. I know what quote it came from. But often I can't do the complex intricacies of math that's necessary to understand if my participants said professional development, did they also say tenure? I can't do the same, the intricacies of math that's necessary to understand, did my 25 and under teachers indicate that professional development was tied to rank and tenure, and then none of my 40-year-olds did. Sometimes that may be how we need to see our data, that maybe age or time in the profession has some influence or impact on how participants shared and responded to our questions as we asked them our questions through the course of our study. So when we query the data, we're gaining a deeper understanding. These help us to make those connections between the data. So we have the query wizard. I'm going to click back on this again just to show us. Now those queries that I just walked through, it's great. I know what a text query does. I know what a word frequency does. I know what a coding query does. I know what a matrix coding query does. That's great. But what if I didn't? What if I only know that I want to see how things are coded in context? That is the benefit of this query wizard. Everything that I just walked through, this is the text search. This is the word frequency search. This is the coding query. And then this was the matrix coding. So that was kind of a pattern there to show you that even if you forget where this, which I do quite frequently, even if you forget what each of these queries will actually do within your data, the query wizard can walk you through these items. So it doesn't need to be something that you're keeping in your back pocket. I also want to just talk briefly about where to look for the charts and diagrams while we're on this page, and then I'll pause for questions and we'll circle back about memos and kind of close out from there. Charts and diagrams are also on this page. I will be honest, I very rarely use the hierarchy chart. Why? Because typically in qualitative inquiry, that hierarchy can sometimes give us inaccurate expectations of the data. When I see something in a hierarchy, it's the human process. It's the way the brain processes visual data. I'm going to assume that there's a hierarchy that exists. This code is more important than this one, or this one carries more sway. And it's not. Every data has meaning and value in a qualitative inquiry, even to the point that we report on outliers in qualitative inquiry. And so that's key to understand. Charts can help us answer questions. We can understand the data in a visual way. Keep in mind, anything in these charts, it's very important. They do not indicate importance. They are simply meant to help you better understand your data. For example, if I go to the charts and I want to understand codes, I can look at coding by transcript. You know, what were the themes or patterns in the data, the patterns of codes in this transcript versus this one. It's also helpful for the focus groups. This focus group talked a lot about X, Y, and Z, while this focus group did not. This person, every single one of their codes does not appear in anyone else's code list. That can be helpful to know. And so this helps us run a chart to say, okay, these are the codes that kind of permeate this particular transcript. Is that true across all of my transcript? These charts can help us make those statements in our chapter 4 that speak to all of our participants indicate, or some of our participants noted, or this was a strong pattern of response across all participants. So charts can help us visually see that. Again, some of us can see it in the narrative information, and that's fine. I can run a query and see it, and it's fine in the narrative format. Some of us need a chart, and that's okay too. There's also, once we have created a chart, and it could be a bar chart. Bars are usually helpful in attributes, you know, race, age, geographic location. We can see, you know, or did most of my answers come from participants of this age? Bars are very helpful. Pie charts help us understand sections of a whole. So we're looking at the total picture, and now we can see the sections that make up that whole pie. So also keep in mind what kind of chart is going to be most helpful for you. But there is a visual representation that will pop up with the chart wizard, as well as a summary. So you will never be left with, okay, this visual graphic, what does that mean? There's always a summary tab that will indicate the breakdown of what appears in that particular chart. When we think of diagrams, diagrams are dynamic. Diagrams help us compare. We don't use this cluster analysis. I know it's active, but we don't use that a lot. What we typically use are these down here. We can compare files, codes, or cases. And what that means is we can see patterns of codes and groupings by file, meaning each one of your interviews, hopefully, is a file. Each one of your focus groups is its own file. So I can see, did, you know, all of my interviews have a similar topic strand? Not everybody likes charts. Diagrams are another way to view the same data. I also want to encourage, this isn't pulling up different information. Again, Nvivo will only do what you tell it. It's only going to work with what you put into it. And diagrams are a different visual representation of what was also shared in the chart. I can now see, hey, did all of my files, people, interviews have similar codes, or were there a couple of outliers? Sometimes the diagram helps you see that outlier in a graphic representation. Do I see cases? Sometimes we have cases that are that we've coded. Those of you who are using cases, maybe you're collecting multiple data sources from the same participant. Maybe this case and this case both had similar codes, but you know what? Case number 2 had some codes that case number 1 did not. And so, let's take a look. Let's do a deeper dive into that. I wonder why that is. Let me take a look at the demographics or maybe the geographic location. These are meant to prompt your curiosity around your data. And diagrams are a visual representation of being able to do that. So I'm going to pause here for questions. Emily, I'm not sure if any popped up. I know we're
Yeah.
also being mindful of time.
Yes. Thank you so much. And first of all, the very first comment slash question, and I'm wondering if you're going to get to this in just a little bit. Actually, I know you're not going to necessarily go over how to code and analyze today,
Yes,
but you can point us to some resources that might be
certainly,
helpful for that.
certainly.
And so that was one of the questions, if there's
Mhm.
something that we can do in the future for that. And just so you know, to that attendee, I hear you, and that is something we'd like to be able to provide for you. But I know that Dr. Nicholson has some sessions that might be helpful in the meantime
Mhm.
for that. And just thank you so much for bringing this to our community. One question here for in the chat that's just popped up. I will be doing a questionnaire.
Mm.
Will I
Mhm.
be using the surveys and report section? Question mark.
So yes, so you're doing a questionnaire, so you will be pulling or importing your data in using the survey function. So one of the key things that I always tell learners is that, you know, you're doing a survey, those are still participants, you're still going to code the data. That data will still be present in any of these queries, any of these reports that you run. So the data, even though it's coming in from a different avenue, it's not, you didn't talk to a live person, there's no transcript per se. View that questionnaire almost as a transcript. So once you import that into Nvivo, using the survey wizard, there is a different way to bring that data in, which we typically go over in some of those more fundamental sessions with Nvivo. Once you bring that data in, it is the same as any interview or any focus group data. You will code it, and those codes and those patterns will be just as applicable to the queries that we just discussed.
And thank you so much, Dr. Nicholson. And the next one is again, just how do we sign up for individual sessions? So I'm not
Wonderful.
sure if we have about 15 minutes, just so
Yes.
you know, for time.
Wonderful. Gotcha. So I just want to talk about actually one other thing. And then, Emily, if I could ask of you after I talk about one more thing, we'll bring up that slide deck, and it's the last slide in that deck. I can definitely talk through some of that contact information. So the last point that I want to just kind of touch on, because it's actually not on these pages, on this page that I've been sharing, are some of the report or export features. How do I get things out of Nvivo? Maybe it's not APA compliant, but it's also something to think about. You know, I don't need to be in front of the screen all day as I'm immersing myself in my data. I always encourage learners, you know, take multiple avenues of immersing yourself with your data. You're done coding, you're done with some of your categorization. That's great. Sit with it. Have some time with it, spend some reflective time with it. And you can't do that on this computer screen. So we need to be able to export some of this data. So how do we do that? There's two ways to do that. First is to use this new text report. I will click on it, but it took me a little while to run some earlier reports, but I'm going to just kind of walk through how you can look at your codes. The information that you pull for your codes, you're going to actually click on this code view, and that will encourage the system to pull your codes in addition to any other information you indicate. So for example, I can simply run a report that is code by structure. So this is something that I ran a little earlier just to be mindful of time. And this actually shows me the codes and then also any sub codes or categories that I've created. So for example, we know in Nvivo, everything's a code. We can't call something a category. We can't call something a theme. But what I can begin to do is I can say, okay, I'm seeing some things bundled together, and we know those are categories. So, for example, in this space, I have emotional well-being. As we coded the data, maybe I identified some depression, maybe I identified some resilience, some balance and wholeness, connection with nature, positive effect. These are actual codes that I've now bundled underneath a category of emotional well-being. So I can export this and sit with this, take this with me, download it, get off of the computer for a little bit and immerse myself a little further in the data. The other way I can pull this information is something we've been hearing a lot. Now, this is something that is the look of this is something fairly recent with the newer update, which the newest, most revamped, revised, refreshed version of Nvivo is available on our site on the student technology resource site. So if you haven't downloaded Nvivo in, I would say maybe it's 6 months, a year. If it's an older version, you may want to revisit and refresh your version. But this actually will not only tell you the code, physical health, but it will also pull your quotes. So these are the actual areas in the document that you swiped and grabbed and coded as physical health. And so this will show you how some of those participants actually responded, some of those actual quotes. In older versions of Nvivo, having these quotes this close to the code was not always possible. So that's something that's newly present in this version. So this is something that's helpful, and that is all accessible in this new text report. You will just click new text report, click your code, and then you tell it what else you want to accompany the code. Do you want the person? Do you want the file name? You can click all of the boxes and get all of the information if you want. But just for the sake of the system and the system freezing, I just ran those reports a little earlier today. So I'm going to stop sharing.
And while we do that, and I
Mhm,
transition into your PowerPoint slide
mhm,
deck,
mhm.
two questions.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Nicholson, you mentioned that even outliers are important. Can
Yes.
you expound on the value of non-responses to certain codes while I go ahead and share my screen?
Yes. So the value of non-responses to certain codes can have there's really kind of two areas. Either that is not a focus or a part of the experience for that particular participant, or that participant may have named their experience something else. So that is where we must check our own biases and understandings as researchers. If I'm doing a study about individuals who participated in professional development, and I get everyone but one actually says professional development, uh, the one participant, maybe I need to look a little bit deeper into their data. Maybe they didn't say professional development, but maybe they talked about, maybe they said something about enrichment, or maybe they said something about growing. So we want to be careful that we are also inclusive of how our participants may be expressing their experience around a certain topic.
And thank you so much for mentioning that. Several people in the chat have said, "Hey, this is my first exposure to Nvivo. I'm going to need some basics." So just so you know, I did pop in the chat from your last session,
Yes.
Nvivo basics,
Yes.
and which was back in June already. Oh my goodness!
Oh my goodness.
And then, of course, I know you're going to dive into some of these asynchronous, synchronous coaching sessions that are available in
Yes.
group sessions. So I'll
Yes.
pause there. There is one more question, hopefully, if we have a little
Mhm,
bit of time for
mhm.
that as well, too.
Yes, certainly. So I do want to encourage you to visit the Academic Success Center. The Academic Success Center is, if you're on your homepage, you click on the Resource Center, we're right there. If you've already registered, thank you so much. If you
You're
haven't
so welcome.
registered, there it is. Here we are. There's a information there to register. So if you want to register, there's also means to speak with someone. Now I'm in here, so we don't have a coach live right now, but typically there would be a coach in chat. So right there where it says ASC chat, offline because I'm in here, but typically someone would be live and be able to answer your questions about registering. And then sometimes if I'm in chat, or if Dr. Mitra, who is my counterpart, who is also familiar with Nvivo, one of the two of us, if we happen to be in chat, we can possibly answer your question right there in chat. So that is a great way to get in touch with us. And then all of our contact information is there on the left bottom side of the screen with our chat option. You can submit your question. You can email us. We even have text as a capability. And then, of course, we have our group sessions that are a group, but still small. 7 students or so is the max. And then individual sessions. So if you have, just want to touch base one-on-one with a coach, I know sometimes I need that one-on-one support. Also, everyone's data is different. Maybe you want that more personalized experience. You can request an individual session. I will say that given my and Dr. Mitra's calendars, I would encourage you to not wait until Thursday if you have something that's due Sunday. Try to get in early if you can. But there's many ways to get in touch with us and get the support that you need.
Thank you so much. I wanted to make sure I could just show how to drive there if need be. And you've mentioned, Dr. Nicholson, there's so many different ways, a list right here of how to get Nvivo support. If it's okay with you, since we have a little bit of time, I'd like to just try to ask some of the questions
Yes.
Okay, great. What I can see is, let me go scroll back up, make sure I have this. Okay. So I've done 3 interviews. Transcripts are 50 pages per interview. Do I enter all 150 pages before coding and analyzing?
Yes. So, hi, Jack. Hi, Dr. Lewis. And so that Dr. Lewis is also one of our coaches, and has great experience with qualitative inquiry. But yes, that is a tremendous amount of data. But I would say that because those are very lengthy, first and foremost, if those are just 3, I would encourage you to start coding as you go. So do not wait until you get through all of your participants, because that would be a very hefty lift altogether. So I would encourage you first to start coding as you go. Try to maybe put a pause in between now and your next live interview. The second thing I would encourage you is to be familiar with the data, maybe outside of Nvivo. That's a lot to read on a screen. I would encourage you to maybe print that out, become familiar with that data in written format, and then maybe do some preliminary work in the margins, maybe jot some thoughts down, and then come into Nvivo and use the function for its functionality and its organization. So just because of the length of those, just to give you an example, the typical length, and Dr. Lewis can correct me if I'm wrong, the typical length that I typically see is somewhere between 6, 7, 8, 9 pages, a transcript for an individual interview. But it's definitely not unusual, depending on the topic, to have such lengthy interviews. But I would definitely say pace yourself and start coding now. Don't wait until you're all done, but they would all get imported.
And would you recommend, should I go to the next slide before we close out? I'm not sure what's next.
No,
So
no.
Okay, we're
This
ending
one's
here.
fine.
Okay, great. And would you recommend for someone who has questions like that, or maybe have that in-depth of interview responses, to attend your sessions and get that one-on-one experience or advice as they move through and processing their data and coding in Nvivo?
Yes, I would. So I would encourage you, even if you're just kind of interested, we do have Nvivo Power Hours. So Nvivo Power Hours are on Sunday. I also host qualitative power hours or qualitative workshops on Thursdays. And so you can just kind of ask those general questions, get that general insight in those more, less formal sessions as well. But definitely, we were all novice researchers at one point. And so it's important to lean on each other, lean on the community that we've built and that we have, and lean on one another. I know I learned something every time I engaged with a learner. I learned something new. So you are teaching us as coaches as much as you think we're giving you, you're giving us just as much. So I would encourage you to interact early and often if possible.
Absolutely. Dr. Nicholson, thank you so very much. I do believe the question was about what time are the power
Oh,
hours on
I
Thursdays?
should have mentioned that it's 2 to 4 Pacific. And Dr. Lewis just posted the Sunday hours in the chat.
Absolutely. And again, just so all of our attendees know, you should be able to see all of that information on the open study session and power hours calendar right on the landing page of the Academic Success Center. So fear not, if you didn't write it down, if you go there, you will be able to find that information. So
Yes.
I do want to thank you so much, Dr. Nicholson, for coming and for furthering our knowledge in Nvivo and qualitative data and coding and analysis. And we appreciate you and all that you do for our students and our community. And thank you to all the attendees for coming today. And as always, until the next time, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.